What constitutes biblical grounds for divorce? And is remarriage possible after such divorce? John Piper doesn't think so. And if you're interested in finding out why and what I think about Piper's view, stay tuned. This is the Bible Sojourner, where we discuss issues related to the Bible, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Shalom and welcome. Thanks for joining. Well, it's great to be with you as always, and I especially want to start this episode by thanking those of you who have reached out over the last few weeks. I really appreciate it. Actually, the last couple episodes that I've done have been somewhat controversial, and I appreciate those who have reached out in support and also who had questions or who wanted to challenge me a little bit. I want you to know I really appreciate all that feedback, and I know I am not the sole emissary of truth or anything like that. So I always love being challenged and I love just being a part of the conversation. So I'm really thankful that we can talk about the important issues of husbands and wives and the roles of women in and out of the home. And I just think that that is such a great opportunity. So if you do or don't like those episodes, feel free to reach out. Let me know. I have appreciated the feedback, and hopefully, Lord willing, as we continue to explore issues in future episodes, we can talk about some of the issues that were raised. And so in any case, I just wanted to let you know that I really do consider everything that's said, and I just really appreciate everything that's been brought up. And today we're going to talk about another controversial episode on divorce and remarriage. But before we do that, I actually have a really exciting announcement. I don't think I maybe have hinted about this on some episodes, but I actually have a copy of my new book in my hand at this very moment, The Baptism Debate, and I'm super thrilled with how it turned out. This is an incredible just resource are you allowed to say that what you do is an incredible resource? Probably not. What I mean to say is that I feel very blown away by just the amazing feedback I've gotten by those who have had a chance to read early release copies and those who have been a part of the process for feedback throughout the whole process. I think it's a very important subject to talk about. The issue of baptism in our churches has been relegated to just a secondary, tertiary issue, which means nothing. And I really think that those in the early church would fight tooth and nail over the importance of baptism. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't get along with people that we disagree with, but I do think it's worth talking about. And so having interacted with multiple people who have fallen on either side of the camp, Paedo-Baptist, Credo-Baptist, those who believe in infant baptism and so on and so forth, I think that this kind of discussion is really important. So I hope it's a helpful resource. I know some of the listeners that I've talked to about this issue have expressed really a lot of excitement about this book, and I just am excited to see what kind of response it generates and see if the Lord would be pleased to do anything with it. And I hope he will be pleased to do that. And if he doesn't, may the Lord receive glory anyway. But anyway, the release date is going to be April 3rd, and that's the week before Easter. I think that baptism and the resurrection are probably the most linked elements of baptism. And so I'm just really excited for that release. So I wanted you to be aware of that, April 3rd. Mark it on your calendars. I'm really excited for that. And I'll be posting some videos periodically about baptism and just what's in the book. And if you're interested, definitely encourage you to check it out. So I just wanted to be helpful. Wanted you to know about that as well, because I know not everyone reads the blog or looks at social media. And so just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, but we're going to talk today about baptism. No, we're not talking about baptism. We're talking about divorce and remarriage. And one of the listeners reached out with a question specifically about John Piper's view of divorce and lack of remarriage. In Piper's view, he believes that somebody who gets divorced has no biblical grounds for remarriage in any scenario. And so this is a pretty significant issue. And the listener was wondering if I would be able to kind of look at Piper's view and give some thoughts on it. And I'd be happy to do that. I think that it's helpful to walk through that. And divorce and remarriage are such important issues in the life of the church. I think a lot of times people don't want to talk about it because, again, it's controversial. And what happens if a pastor's preaching on this and one of the most, rich people in the church is a divorcee, and the pastor is speaking out against this individual who maybe got divorced illegitimately? How should we think about that? So I just want to put this out there as a resource. Lord willing, we'll be able to think through this idea together and look at some biblical principles and hopefully come away with the biblical picture of what constitutes a biblical divorce, and then whether or not remarriage is allowed in such instances. So what we're going to do is we're going to look here at Piper's article, and so I've put it in a PDF form here, and so I'm going to be working my way through this. As you can see, if you're watching the video, I'm going to read some of the sections so that if you're listening, obviously you won't miss anything. And going through this, one of the things that I would point out is that in the introduction, this paper comes from July 21st, 1986. So this is an old paper now, but this was when Piper was preaching through the book of Luke. He came across Luke 16 and a statement which seemed to be an absolute condemnation of divorce and remarriage in any context. And so he formulated his position on divorce and remarriage, but it should be noted that this actually went against what the leadership of Bethlehem Baptist Church ended up deciding to implement in their church assembly every day. And so Piper actually links to the statement on divorce and remarriage in the life of Bethlehem Baptist Church, which dates to 1989. And so I think that that's worth noting that Piper, I'll give this to him. Piper, even though he believes strongly on this matter, as we can see from his paper, he also acknowledged that he was not the sole leader of the church. And so the other elders and leaders instituted a different policy, which corresponds more with the mainstream view, which we'll talk about. But regardless, Piper is worth dealing with. He often has very good thoughts on issues, and I think that it's important to walk through this. So in his background to the issue, he just talks about how he had felt an immense burden to try to get this issue right for those who were part of the congregation. And that's something we can definitely appreciate. I think that Piper, if nothing else, he has a lot that he has contributed to evangelicalism, but if nothing else, he has always been known for a passion for people and to see them please the Lord through obedience to his word. And so, he just talks about how in his own life, he just felt a burden for Christians in church to be able to understand this. And so he says in his summary of the introduction, this paper is an attempt to state my own understanding of the issues and their foundation in Scripture. It serves then as a biblical rationale for why I feel constrained to make the decisions I do with regard to whose marriages I will perform and what sort of church discipline seems appropriate in regard to divorce and remarriage. Now, he does make a disclaimer about how this is just a survey. It's just a broad paper which raises the issues, but it's not a book level response. He does have writings that go beyond this paper on divorce and remarriage, and we might reference some of those. We'll see. But I think this just gives us a good talking outline to talk about what kind of issues he's raising and whether or not they are effective or even an appropriate way to think about these issues. And to start off, I would say this: it's very important not just to think about what results you get, what viewpoint you end up holding, but why you get there. So methodology is so important. All right, so we're going to go through some of these reasons, and then I have some other resources that I want to point you to with regard to how to think through this issue. So first of all, he gives his main section of the paper is 11 reasons why I believe all remarriage after divorce is prohibited while both spouses are alive. So his view, to summarize, would be that once you get married, that marriage is indissoluble. There is no dissolution of that marriage. Even if divorce takes place, that marriage remains intact while both spouses are alive. Okay? So the first reason he points to as an argument for this is Luke 16:18, which calls all remarriage after divorce adultery. So he quotes it in his paper. Luke 16:18 says, "Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery." So he talks about how this verse shows Jesus does not recognize divorce as terminating a marriage in God's sight. Now, I would say, as we think about this issue, that there are more things to consider here. Okay, uh, he says, as a follow up to this, he says the second half of the verse shows that not merely the divorcing man is guilty of adultery when he remarries, but also any man who marries a divorced woman. And then he says, since there are no exceptions mentioned in the verse, and since Jesus is clearly rejecting the common cultural conception of divorce as including the right of remarriage, the first readers of this gospel would have been hard put to argue for any exceptions on the basis of that Jesus shared the cultural assumption that divorce for unfaithfulness or desertion freed a spouse for remarriage. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here, so this is his first point, but I think it's helpful to point this out, is that he's painting the picture here from absolute to questionable. He's going to work through other points that later on that are not as strong, but he's trying to build a cumulative case from his strongest points, and that's really how most people argue anyway. And that's okay. That's a good rhetorical device. But notice that this is a very absolute statement. He says there are no exceptions mentioned. This is just flat out, 100% what we might call in Old Testament studies. It's not casuistic law, but it's thus saith the Lord. This is a full on prohibition. But even as you go on to his next point, so he refers to Mark 10, 11, and 12 and next, he immediately demonstrates that how Mark uses it includes additional details which Luke does not. So the point is, Luke very clearly in his recalling of Jesus's discussion on divorce does not include all the details that Mark and Matthew end up doing. So it's like we talk about in the synoptic gospel studies, is that no eyewitness will typically, there may be some exceptions to this, but no eyewitness will typically relate everything. And we acknowledge that in every passage. So for Piper to talk about there being no exceptions or no additional details given here, well, that is a point worth considering, but it's perhaps not as strong as he wants to make it. So in Mark 10, 11, and 12, we read, this is Piper's statement now, remarriage after divorce is adultery, whether it is the husband or of the wife who does the divorcing. So Mark 10, 11, and 12, and he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. And so Piper notes that this text repeats the first half of Luke 16:18, but goes further and says that not only the man who divorces, but also a woman who divorces and then remarries is committing adultery. Now, what I would point out here is that, so are we, now this is, I know I'm going to belabor this throughout this whole episode because this is so crucial, because Piper's initial point in Luke 16:18, one of the initial points that he makes is, what would the original audience have thought? It's difficult in Piper's view to think, okay, if the original audience is reading Luke 16:18, it's difficult to see them thinking, okay, there's any exception to this. But then he quotes Mark, and Mark, in talking through this issue, gives additional details. So are we to assume then that Luke, the audience that Luke is written to, that when they read that, they're saying, oh, but this doesn't apply to women, right? Do you understand what I'm saying? Is you can't expect every single passage to deal with every single element of the picture. In fact, as I've been studying baptism, since it's on my mind, as you know why, one of the things that I point out in different discussions of passages that deal with baptism is that you can't expect every passage on baptism to deal with every single element or component of baptism. And everybody who talks about baptism understands that. And in the same sense, we should allow that understanding to influence our discussion of divorce. Every time Jesus discusses divorce, whether it be in the Gospels or whether Paul discusses it in 1 Corinthians 7, wherever you have, or the Old Testament, let's not neglect that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Anytime you have a discussion of divorce, you can't expect everything to be repeated in every passage. And I know Piper understands that methodologically, but I think this is the case of where he's allowing himself to make methodologically unsound arguments to make it seem like his argument has more weight to it. Okay, so now he brings up in his third point, so he's got 11 of these. His third point is that Mark 10 and Matthew 19, in those passages, Jesus, these are his words now, Jesus rejected the Pharisees' justification of divorce from Deuteronomy 24:1 and reasserted the purpose of God in creation, that no human being separated what God has joined together. Now, one of the interesting things about that, Piper really kind of ignores a key issue in this. In his statement that Jesus rejected the Pharisees' justification of divorce from Deuteronomy 24:1, it really ignores a key issue that's involved here. And to illustrate that, we kind of need to jump over to another article that I have referenced here. And this is an article, well, let me go to the beginning here. The article is by Andrew David Naselli, and it's in Detroit Baptist Theological Journal. It was published in 2019. And he wrote the article, What the New Testament Teaches About Divorce and Remarriage. And what's interesting about his discussion of this issue is that he basically went to Piper's church for very long. He was a part of the leadership, and he basically wrote this journal article in response to Piper in many ways. And so I think this is a helpful, and obviously he goes into much more detail because it's not just a outline of a position paper. It's a full-blown article talking about the ins and outs of these academic issues. And one of the things that he points out here, he does a good job of summarizing it, is that during the time of Jesus, you didn't just have one Pharisaical view about divorce and remarriage. Okay, that's what Piper's statement implies, but everybody who studies this issue understands that there's a significant debate in the issue of divorce and remarriage. Well, actually, I should say it's really only in the case of divorce, because divorce in the ancient world, both in the Old Testament world as well, Jewish context as well as in the Greco-Roman context, it assumed remarriage. So divorce, if it was ever allowable, assumed that remarriage was also allowable. There was just no other category for that in the ancient world. So that's going to be an important contextual point to make as well. And so when Jesus is asked this question, it would be incorrect, though, to think that all the Pharisees, all the Jewish leaders were united on one view with regard to divorce out of Deuteronomy 24. In fact, there were two prominent rabbis that preceded Christ, and they were Shammai and Hillel. Maybe you've heard those names before. And Shammai and Hillel both held differing views on divorce. Now, Shammai's view, he held what ended up being the minority Jewish viewpoint at the time, and that's that only if a wife committed some act of immorality could there be a divorce. So it was very strict. Basically, you weren't allowed to get a divorce unless there was adultery or sexual immorality that was involved. And so that was the typical view for Shammai. And Hillel's view, that many associated with, was the view that you could have a divorce for any reason. And of course, and as a backdrop to this, one of the things, you might not know Hebrew, but in Hebrew, one of the issues of translation in Deuteronomy 24:1 is this phrase. It's called ervat davar. Ervat davar is how you say it in Hebrew, and usually English translations will translate it as any matter of indecency or something like that. And what the rabbis interpreted that as meaning in the school of Hillel was that, okay, indecency is one thing and then matter is another thing. So the phrase refers to multiple things, indecency or any other matter. In other words, that's how the Hillel camp would interpret it. But Shammai's camp viewed it as, okay, this is a unified phrase and it just refers to sexual immorality. And so that is the only legitimate grounds for divorce according to Deuteronomy 24:1. So it was a very significant debate during the time. And so if we go back to Piper's phrase here in his point number 3, he says that Jesus rejected the Pharisees' justification of divorce from Deuteronomy 24:1. That's not exactly true. In reality, most people understand Jesus to be actually agreeing with one of the camps there. If Jesus is interpreting in Matthew 19 and Matthew 5, if Jesus is saying that divorce is unacceptable except for sexual immorality, just on face value, that fits perfectly with the camp of Shammai, the rabbi, who said that no, only sexual immorality is the justification for legitimate divorce. And that pretty much aligns exactly with what Jesus said, unless you reinterpret what Jesus said to mean something else, which Piper is forced to do. But one of the things that Piper doesn't mention here, and he probably does in his book, but I haven't read his book all the way through. One of the things that we need to understand is that there's a whole contextual backdrop to this. And when people are hearing things, they're not hearing things in a vacuum, okay? They're hearing things that they have a cultural context for. And many of the Jews that Jesus is talking to understand this debate that the rabbis and the teachers among the Pharisees and among the Jewish leaders, they are engaging in this debate. So this is a tactic. It's a legitimate question, but it's a tactic by the Jewish leaders to try to alienate different segments of the Jewish population because Jesus was so popular. So I just want to point that out because I think yes, Jesus does appeal to creation to renew the appreciation for marriage and the creational backdrop of marriage. I think that's absolutely correct, and I definitely appreciate Piper making that case. But that also kind of causes Piper, I think, to ignore that Jesus actually did end up answering the question that the Pharisees asked him. And so he ended up agreeing in large part, if not totally, with Shammai. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind. Contextually, there's a big backdrop going on there. And when Matthew's readers or Mark's readers or Luke's readers are listening to this, they're filtering what is being said and what is being read to them through this cultural context. Okay. All right. He goes on. Number 4, in Matthew 5:32, this does not teach that remarriage is lawful in some cases. Rather, it reaffirms that marriage after divorce is adultery, even for those who have been divorced innocently, and that a man who divorces his wife is guilty of the adultery of her second marriage unless she had already become an adulteress before the divorce. Okay, so Matthew 5:32 says, "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity," this is an older translation, "makes her an adulteress." So it makes her an adulteress if you divorce her illegitimately, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, one of the things, and so what Piper goes on to argue here is that basically this argument makes no sense, that if you divorce someone legitimately, or if the woman in this case, if the man was divorcing her illegitimately, that would be essentially spousal abandonment, and the woman would be innocent. But why does it say then that this makes the woman an adulteress? Well, in Piper's reasoning, it's because the marriage remains intact and that she shouldn't be getting remarried anyway. So that would be his understanding of the issue. And there are alternative ways to take this. Okay. So I think it's important to concede that is a possibility. But again, I think that this isn't the most natural way to take it, and there are other alternatives. Okay, so one of the things that Naselli points out here in his argument is that this translation, "makes her commit adultery," is possibly, and he would say probably, better translated differently. And so he points out how Craig Blomberg, a member of the NIV Committee on Bible Translation, explains why the new NIV translated differently. So the new NIV translates it as makes her the victim of adultery. And so here's the explanation. So in modern grammatical and linguistic studies, you have all of these databases of Greek texts. And so grammarians have tagged all of those words. And so you can run these deep and complex grammatical searches. And one of the things that Blomberg and some of the NIV committee decided in running those searches is that you basically don't have any what's called deponent uses of this verb. So a deponent simply in Greek studies, it's where the form of the word is middle or it's passive, but yet it takes an active meaning. So what that means is typically the passive idea is that something happens to you. So you have been hit by the ball, but it's active if you say you hit the ball. So there are two ideas there. So the word commit adultery here is actually in the passive. And so what Blomberg and others of the NIV committee argued is that because this word is in the passive, it should be understood that the woman has been adulterated. But we don't talk like that. So how are you to translate that? Is that she has had adultery committed against her. She's been the victim of adultery. And so in searching through all these databases, they cannot find uses of this word for adultery used in the passive sense as a deponent or as an active form. So what that means then, at least according to this argument, is that what is being said in this passage is not necessarily that she also commits adultery, but that she has had adultery committed against her. So the way that we would read this is, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, instead of makes her an adulteress, somebody who commits adultery, it would be causes her to be a victim of adultery. So in other words, the one who divorces his wife commits adultery against her. And so this is a possible meaning of the phrase. Now, I'm not saying that's the only way how to take it either, but Naselli and Blomberg and others have argued that way. I think that it's possible still to have this meaning the way that most English translations translate it. I think that it could even still be translated as somebody who commits adultery, just understanding that if it's an illegitimate divorce, then you still have, it's not a justifiable divorce, and therefore remarriage is also not justifiable. So in that sense, you would have the need to remain single and not get remarried. And so that's possible understanding of that. One of the arguments that Blomberg makes in support of his view, where it's talking about the victimhood of that, is that it wasn't a slam dunk 100% of the time occurrence that a woman who had been divorced would get remarried. Maybe she would stay unmarried. And in those cases, how could you say that she is committing adultery when she's not getting remarried? And so perhaps that is another good argument for taking this phrase in Matthew 5 as evidence of being a victim of adultery, not necessarily being a perpetrator of adultery. It's something to keep in mind for sure. Okay, so going on with Piper's arguments then, we could obviously talk about a lot of things, but one of the notes that I want to really zero in on is his discussion of Matthew 19 and his use of Deuteronomy 24. Okay, so let's go to Deuteronomy 24 first. So in his 8th point, he talks about how Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 does not legislate grounds for divorce, but teaches that the one flesh relationship established by marriage is not obliterated by divorce or even by remarriage. So he quotes Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 in full. It says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. So in explaining this passage, what Piper notes is that he says in the second part of 8:1 there, also on the implication of Deuteronomy 24:4, that remarriage after divorce defiles a person. In other words, there were ample clues in the Mosaic law that the divorce concession was on the basis of the hardness of man's heart and really did not make divorce and remarriage legitimate. Now, here's one of the interesting things, and this is where I think maybe just Old Testament studies gives me a different way of thinking about this than maybe Piper thinks about it. And he doesn't talk a lot about the Old Testament, but he does bring up Deuteronomy 24 because Deuteronomy 24 is so clearly the backdrop of Matthew 19. And Matthew 19 is so clearly the primary place where Jesus discusses divorce. So that's connected there. But Piper also ignores a few other passages where divorce is actually mentioned. So one of the passages that I think is often ignored is in Exodus 21, and in verse 10, we have a discussion about a woman, and it's talking about somebody who is married, a woman, and we're told in verse 10 that if this individual who has already married somebody, if he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. So in other words, there are three spheres that a husband needs to care for his wife. And in verse 11, it says, if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. So most scholars would take that as an indication of divorce. And that does seem to be the issue here, that if this woman is not receiving proper care from her husband, if she has been, maybe to use the terminology we often use, spousal abandonment, if she has been abandoned, she can leave and get a certificate of divorce because of the husband's abuse, as it were. And so, Piper doesn't mention Exodus 21 in his position paper, but I think it's not correct to say that divorce was not a topic of discussion in Old Testament law. It certainly was. In fact, another passage that perhaps is even a little more confounding is in Deuteronomy 22. We actually have certain scenarios where divorce is prohibited. And I think this is really fascinating. You have, for example, in verses 28 and 29 of Deuteronomy 22, a law, casuistic law. By the way, I just wrote a blog article on this, and I posted it on my website if you're interested. It's a blog, or it's a passage about a man who meets a virgin and he rapes her. So this is essentially rape language. And so if this man meets this virgin, he rapes her, it says then in verse 29, then that the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. Now, the reason I mentioned that I've written a blog article on this is because a lot of people really struggle with the fact that a woman may have been forced to marry her rapist. And I argue in the blog article that that's not exactly how to understand this law, that it's a little more complex than that. And presumably the woman and father would have to think that was best for the woman to marry this man. So I don't think you have to read the article. But the reason why I bring this up, though, is because there's actually a prohibition against divorce here. That's what's so strange, is that in this scenario, this man is not allowed to divorce her ever for any reason. That's what's crazy. And that's actually rather, let's put it this way. This is very pro-woman, pro-feminist kind of ideology here. And it's very protecting of the woman because this is her livelihood. And okay, I gotta spill some of this because one of the reasons why this is here is because in the ancient Near East, you didn't have banks, you didn't have Social Security, you didn't have welfare. There was nothing like that, right? And so when you're dealing with how is this woman going to be taken care of for the rest of her life, this is one of those issues where God allows this to protect her if she has no other options. And so by disallowing divorce and mandating this upon the man, that's very countercultural, and it's very counter the experience that you find in other ancient Near Eastern law as well. And so I think that this is worth camping out on, just to make the simple point that there are laws on the books which talk about how divorce is not an option in these scenarios. And so to kind of make the point again, which I've been kind of trying to solidify and make throughout, is that both the ancient culture as well as the scripture understand remarriage to be assumed when divorce is allowed. Okay, so that's basically the concept which we need to keep hammering away. In fact, that's where I think Piper misses a little bit, especially with regard to his understanding of the cultural context. He doesn't bring a lot of that in. And one of the reasons for that is because what we have rabbinical evidence, for example, and we have rabbinical. So David Instone Brewer has written a book. I think it was published in 2001. Is on divorce and remarriage in the Bible. Really great resource. And he has a variety of interviews on podcasts out there as well. You can definitely find those. And one of the things that he mentions is that we have a lot of rabbinical evidence about what divorce certificates looked like. So on the divorce certificate, when a woman was given a divorce certificate, it says, you're divorced, et cetera. And that says, and free to remarry any man. Of course, obviously it would have to be an Israelite. In the Jewish instance, of course it'd have to be an Israelite. But when that statement also has parallels in Babylonian literature and other ancient Near Eastern literature which predate Jesus. So it's one of those things where it's almost certain when we're talking about the stipulations that are given in divorce certificates found in Matthew or Deuteronomy 24, even up to the time of Jesus. Certainly in the time of Jesus, there was an assumption that even the divorce certificate, it said on it, you have obtained this divorce and now you are free to remarry. Okay, so that was the current cultural consensus, and is very similar in the Greco-Roman world as well. In fact, Instone Brewer said something that I'm actually not sure. Well, I'll say it this way: I haven't verified what he said, and I don't think I would agree with him 100% on this. But he said that it was at certain points in Roman law. He says there are laws on the book at various times in Roman society because the Romans wanted to perpetrate a greater citizenry. There are laws on the Roman books where a widower or a widow was required to be remarried within 18 months. And he also mentioned that there are laws where somebody who had been divorced was required to be remarried within 12 months in Roman law. Now, I don't think that's certainly not the case at all times under Roman law. There may have been brief exceptions during that point, but the point is well made that there are certainly expectations of getting remarried when you're divorced or when you are lose your spouse through death. I mean, that is the expectation. And in the Jewish world, that was also the case. There in the rabbinical discussions, again, Instone Brewer, this time he has more sources that I feel much more comfortable with. And one of the things that he points out is that the rabbis had discussions about whether or not when you were released from the obligation to get remarried and have kids. And so because it relates to the mandate for the people of God to produce children, to be fruitful and multiply. And so when are you released from this obligation? And so he was citing the rabbis, where the rabbis would say, okay, if you've had 2 children, then you are released from that obligation, et cetera. So it was definitely a discussion and an expectation culturally. You would have stood out if you got divorced and you didn't remarry, or you would have stood out if you didn't remarry when the cultural expectation and push was to do so. And so I think it's helpful to recognize that as kind of a undergirding issue with regard to this. All right, so Piper goes on and he basically draws from 1 Corinthians 7. One of his arguments that he makes is that in 1 Corinthians 7, there are different words that Paul uses for being bound together and being free. And so his argument is that because Paul uses different words, he's using one in technical sense and one not in a technical sense. And he's talking about different realities. Well, that's a pretty significant argument that I don't think has a lot of weight, or it doesn't have the weight that I think that he assumes it does. And again, Naselli has a good section on this. So in his section, which talks about 1 Corinthians 7 and Paul's different usage of words, because there it seems rather clear. Paul seems to say very clearly that if somebody is not enslaved in marriage, they allow their unsaved spouse to depart. That seems to constitute divorce. And then it says they are not enslaved or they are not bound, so they are therefore free to be married. Well, he says there are two views on this. So the first view is that the Christian is free to divorce, but not to remarry. So that would be one. But then the second one would be that the Christian is free to divorce and remarry. So he says, not enslaved in verse 15 of 1 Corinthians 7, conceptually parallels bound and free to be married in verse 39 of the same chapter. Additionally, or second, the ancient Greco-Roman world and the Jewish world did not have a category for a lawful divorce that excluded remarriage. Now, I mentioned Piper's argument to that. He says that there are different words that are used there, and Naselli actually quotes Piper in full there, and he actually alludes to Piper's work on divorce and remarriage there, not just the paper. So Piper is quoted in full there, but for sake of time, I'm just going to, I already summarized what he argued, but here's Naselli's response, and I think this is hitting the nail on the head absolutely. So on the one hand, he says this reading by Piper seems to commit two exegetical fallacies. First, distinguishing synonyms in contexts where they function synonymously, and then second, falsely assuming a technical meaning. The words doulao in verse 15 and deo in verse 39, those are the words for to be enslaved and to be bound. He said they are synonymous in this context. Why must Paul use the same word? He often uses synonyms. For example, in verses 10 through 11, Paul writes that a wife should not separate from her husband and that the husband should not divorce his wife. But those are used synonymously. In fact, Instone Brewer, again, in an article that he wrote for Tyndale Bulletin, so a different source than his other resource that he wrote on divorce and remarriage in the Bible, he actually examined a lot of the Greek papyri, so the extra biblical Greek sources, and he pointed out that very clearly these terms are used synonymously in ancient Greek to communicate divorce. So just because you're using different terms doesn't mean you're not talking about the same issue, right? And so we understand that intuitively. In fact, our grammar teachers often tell us that we should use synonyms instead of say the exact same thing the same way every time, right? So I think that just makes a lot of sense. And so, and it's also one of the things that Naselli brings up is something we've already talked about with regard to on the Jewish divorce certificates, as well as in the Roman customs and law, when you got divorced, you were viewed as being free to marry anybody. And so it seems kind of special pleading when you argue that, okay, it says you are free, but that, it means that you can divorce, but you can't remarry. That's the difficulty. And that's one of the things that I think where Piper really lacks in his argumentation is the cultural context of divorce, but not remarriage is just so categorically not present that would have had to have been explicitly spelled out by Paul and Jesus. Okay. Now we go back to one of the things that Piper mentions with regard to Matthew 19, and that's the exception clause. So this is his last point, point number 11. The exception clause of Matthew 19:9 need not imply that divorce on account of adultery frees a person to be remarried. All the weight of the New Testament evidence given in the preceding 10 points is against this view, and there are several ways to make good sense out of this verse. so that it does not conflict with the broad teaching of the New Testament that remarriage after divorce is prohibited. So now notice again the slight argument which he's using and relying on here. And again, I don't think that this is wrong to argue this way, but we just need to recognize why these arguments are being made. He's saying, based on all of the things that have come prior, so all of his other arguments, he's trying to argue from the strongest to the maybe less believable. So what he's going to argue for here is a very difficult grammatical concept, okay? But it could work this way if all of the other things fall into place that he's trying to make them fall into place. But like I said, like I've been saying this whole time, I don't actually think Piper's views here are very strong. I don't think that they are exactly, I don't think they're great arguments. I think, like I said, Naselli does a great job of just walking through it at an academic level and letting the readers know, okay, where do we stand contextually, culturally, linguistically. I think Naselli has the high ground with regard to that. So what he would argue is that the exception clause for this is not that when he says except for immorality, he thinks that this is a reference. I'm reading in the second part of this discussion, is that the only other place where Matthew 5:32 and 19:9, where Matthew uses the word porneia is the word there that's used for fornication or sexual immorality or unchastity, is in 15:19, where it is used alongside of moikeia. Therefore, the primary contextual evidence for Matthew's usage is that he conceives of porneia as something different than adultery. Could this mean then that Matthew conceives of porneia in its normal sense of fornication or incest rather than adultery? So one of the things that he argues for is that perhaps when Matthew is talking about this except for, fornication or immorality, it's actually a reference to something other than adultery. It could be fornication, which takes place during the betrothal period, or something akin to that. But one of the things that I would point out is that doesn't make as much sense given the full contextual usage of porneia. So I've just gone to the notes in Naselli again, and he has a section which talks about this issue and the usage of porneia. And he quotes Instone Brewer in a footnote, and Instone Brewer notes that the term porneia and its cognates are used in the New Testament of referring to a prostitute, 1 Corinthians 6, incest, 1 Corinthians 5, general sexual sin by a married person, 1 Corinthians 7, use of cultic prostitutes, Revelation 2, and the sin of the whore of Babylon, Revelation 17, 18, and 19. The most common meaning is general sexual immorality, Acts 15:20, Ephesians 5:3, Colossians 5:3. This family of words is used outside the New Testament with the same wide range of meanings. So what we understand in going through this issue is that there are certainly areas where porneia is used generically in a reference to broad sexual sin. In fact, I would say that in my own studies of 1 Corinthians and how Leviticus is used in 1 Corinthians, that was the same conclusion I came to, was that when porneia is referenced, it's a broad reference to any kind of sexual sin, well, in a lot of cases. So to make it, to try to fine tune it as a technical term or to isolate it in Matthew saying like, well, he's not talking about adultery with porneia, he's talking about something else. I just don't think that that's appropriate. That certainly is not consistent with the broad usage. You would have to, you're arguing, you're being very specific in your argument, Piper is, and it's not consistent with the broad majority of the evidence. And so that's difficult. And I think that's not necessary, and I think even dangerous in many ways. All right, now we've talked a lot about this issue, and I want to hit it from one more element. And Naselli, again, has done a great job of giving examples about this. So remember, Piper works from the most concise statements and then goes into the more complex. And I'm not exactly sure that's the best methodology, because I also think, and he should admit this, that there are uh, ways to deal with those seemingly uh, direct statements in Luke 16, in Mark. Just because it seems to not allow any exceptions, how do we explain that? Well, I think that there are ways to explain this. So again, I go back to the cultural context. When somebody hears this, how are they going to hear it in their context? I think there are plenty of examples that we can give of when somebody says something, our mind automatically fills in the exceptions. And so Naselli gives 5 examples. So he actually refers to Matthew 5:28, and he says, when Jesus says, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent, that is purposely sexually desiring that woman, has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Well, that seems to be a very absolute statement. But we understand that there's an exception to that. And that's if you're married, Jesus means everyone who looks at a woman except for his wife, right? Because you are allowed to look at and desire your wife in those ways, right? So that is obviously an exception that Jesus didn't have to spell out. That's just a part of everybody knows that. And so that's why Jesus doesn't have to spell it out in many ways. And that's why the gospel writers don't need to wax eloquently about defending those things. And Naselli gives a couple other examples. If we are told that the speed limit is 70 miles an hour on the freeway and that it's against the law to drive more than 10 miles an hour underneath that, one of the things that Naselli notes is that, well, what happens in a traffic jam or during, icy winds, snowfall, all those things? Well, those are obvious exceptions that don't need to be spelled out because people understand that, right? Or the no trespassing signs. There are certain situations where trespassing is lawful and even the right thing to do, right? So if you're going by and you see, Naselli points out, that if you see a house that's on fire and the family's still asleep, going in there to wake them up and get them out is certainly within the exception of the no trespassing, right? And then you also have in Romans 3:10, the statement, none is righteous, no, not one. But, God is obviously righteous, but we understand that. See, we fill in the blanks when we read, and that's normal, right? It's normal to fill in the blanks when we read. And I think that that's where, when we talk about this divorce issue, the cultural context is so clear. We have so much data on this. It really should be a lot easier to work through, at least understanding that there are legitimate areas of divorce, or where divorce is permissible or allowable. And in such cases, remarriage is assumed to be allowable as well. You would have to be very, very specific that that's not allowable. So I've mentioned that before, but I just want to be clear, because somebody might say, well, you never actually talked too much about those issues. So what I believe Scripture talks about with regard to the permissibleness of divorce would be divorce in the area of sexual immorality. Now, I do think that does cover a broad area of sins, and that's not just limited to adultery. So I think that there could be lots of things there. I do think consistent habitual uses of pornography may fall under that, and I know that's already raising a bunch of issues, but that's definitely a possibility. There are other areas of sexual immorality that could fall under that rubric, where divorce would be permissible. That's something we didn't get a chance to talk about too much, but that is a key difference between how Jesus talked about it and the rabbis talked about it. Is one of the key differences in how Jesus talked about it is that the rabbis, the Pharisees, posed the question to Jesus as such. The law states that the so and so must get divorced in this case or not, but Jesus said it is permissible for them to get divorced. And so I think that's another argument that Jesus understands that divorce is permissible in some instances, but we can hold these two truths in hand: the one truth that divorce is permissible, and the other truth that God hates divorce. We can actually hold those two truths hand in hand, and We just want to do what's right according to Scripture. And there are some scenarios living in a fallen world where a husband or a wife commits adultery and the marriage cannot continue. And so it's dissolved, biblically sanctioned, dissolving, and then the spouses are free to remarry. I think that would be how Christ outlined his stipulations. And then in 1 Corinthians 7, I also believe there Paul is clear. He makes a reference to Christ's teaching, but then he also talks about the spousal abandonment, which is how it's often phrased, as being a legitimate cause for divorce. And I think that matches pretty closely with Exodus 21 with regard to verses 10 and 11 there, where those three categories of food, clothing, and marital rights, if the spouse doesn't take care of another spouse in those instances, in those areas, that constitutes abandonment and she can go out. So I do think that there are legitimate grounds of divorce, but that's far different than the Hillel camp, the rabbinical Hillel camp of no fault divorce, where for any reason, you just, my spouse didn't shower this week, so boom, getting a divorce. Well, I don't think that that's acceptable. But I do think that the Bible does say that divorce is permissible in some instances. They are dangerous. They are disastrous instances. And divorce is, in my mind, never ideal, but it is allowable in some instances. And then whenever divorce is biblically permissible, I would argue that it is also allowable to be remarried as well. Now, bringing it back to what Piper talked about, I just want to commend Piper because he deals with these issues well, because he is working out of a personal conviction. And he was even able to minister alongside fellow leaders who did not agree with him and who implemented a different policy. And so I think that's important too, is that you also, even if somebody didn't agree with me, I would say you can't go against your conscience. That's really important as well. I just think thinking through these issues is really a key part of the discussion. We ought to be having these discussions regularly, trying to think through them with biblical insight. So hope this has been helpful and causing us to do just that. In any case, it's always a pleasure to spend time with you working through these biblical subjects. And I'm just really thankful that the spring semester is in full progress at the seminary and things are going well there. Appreciate all of you who've prayed or reached out at various points to be encouraging. And again, looking forward to the new baptism book coming out. Don't forget to check it out, and release date is April 3rd for that. In the meantime, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you.